When Warfield looks at the Reformation, he says these guys were under duress. Sometimes the threat of life and limb was hanging over them. And so what they have to do is they have to not only be in the midst of controversy, but they have to hold tight to the things that they know are true. And so, for instance, Warfield says, Calvin believed in infallibility and inerrancy and inspiration and all of those things. All of those things were things that he believed, held to, but he just did not have the time and the energy to weave them together in such a way that that he could express them. And so he had to basically bequeath that to the next generation and say, here, it's for you to systematize and codify these things in such a way that that is consistent with all of the things that we hold true about Scripture. And what Warfield says is this: he says, what the Reformers didn't have the time to do, the Protestant scholastics understood as basically corollaries of a theory that was handed down to them. So, for instance, dictation, they believed, was the theory that was handed down to them by the Reformers. And Warfield says, no, dictation's not the theory that was handed down to them by the Reformers that explained all these other things. Basically, dictation is sort of how you might describe the end product. It is as if all of these things produce something that was dictated by God. But it wasn't dictated by God because there's a human and the divine that work together in this. And I think that Warfield is one of those guys that puts his finger on this, not just in the Reformers and the Protestant scholastics, but he puts his finger on this in people like Charles Hodge. For instance, in Charles Hodge, what he does is the reason why he includes Charles Hodge in a list of people who embrace concursus as the mode of inspiration is because he goes back and he looks at what Hodge has written. And if you compare what Hodge has written, it's really interesting. In one section of his systematic theology, he says that he describes it as sort of there's a human element that's involved in Scripture. But later, when he talks about Scripture inspiration in another place in his systematics, he talks about it as an example under what he defines as the potentia absolute, or that which is of God with no human intervention at all. And that's when he talks about miracles. He talks about inspiration under that. And it's really interesting, if you look at Hodge and you try to bring those two pieces together that are in two different sections of his theology, you go, this doesn't work. In one place, he wants to affirm human creativity and actual human contribution to the Scriptures. And in another place, he says, no, the inspiration is just purely potentia absoluta. And so basically, I think what Warfield wonders is, how do those things go together? And basically, he says, here's a man who also didn't have the time to bundle these things that we know to be true together and give them to the church. For instance, let me just say it like this. Warfield would have affirmed what Hodge was saying. He would have affirmed that there was a creative element involved in the Scriptures, at least in the concursive element. There are places where he said dictation is, for instance, in the prophetic mode, dictation is the mode. But there were places where he said, no, there's a human creativity that's involved here. But he would have also said that there's this sense in which inspiration is from God. It's an act of God, and it's not like the providential preparation of the author of Scripture. And so he would have affirmed both of those things. But I think for Warfield, concursus was the way of bringing those ideas together. It was a way that Hodge rejected. But I think Warfield said, I think it was almost as if he would have said, I think if my professor would have given a little more thought to this, and we could have answered some of his objections, he might have watched these two come together in a friendly union with this mode. And
follow-up question, Jeff. I'm sorry, just
yeah,
to
no,
yeah, I thought you were going to break and I jumped in too soon. But
nope,
while we're here, just
yeah.
for clarification, is in fact what is going on here then is articulating inspiration in terms of a special act of providence. So concursus, of course, comes up in theological discourse, especially in the Reformed tradition, with regard to providence. And then there are, of course, ways in which God operates. Especially, there are special acts of providence. There are common operations of providence. So, when we say concursus, is that understood in terms of a special act of God's providence? The act of inspiration or the mode of inspiration in terms of concursus, is there a connection at all with the doctrine of providence, or is concursus sort of being dropped into the discussion de novo? Maybe you can fill us in a little bit on that connection.
Yeah, in 1880, after they published, they being Warfield and Hodge, published the article on inspiration, somebody wrote a critique of them, and the critique was um, that their article was basically an expression of mere providence. And what's really interesting about that is Warfield comes back and answers that in an editorial and said, who even said anything about inspiration being providential? And and then, it's interesting, after, in I think it's in 1894, after he sort of comes to the solidification of his own understanding of concursus as the best way of expressing the mode of inspiration, he writes an article called God Overall. And in that article, he talks about the providential preparation of the individuals, but he never talks about inspiration in terms of providential. And I think the reason why is he's really wanting to make sure that people don't misunderstand him. So I know you're referring to a common and a special act, and he might have said, sure, a special act of providence, I'm willing to go there if we nuance it and flesh it out. But I think what he's wanting to do for the general public, and for the the combatants that are in this controversy, is say inspiration is an act of God, and providential preservation is what God does to prepare these authors. But inspiration is an act of the Spirit of God upon those authors.